Welcome to the New York Botanical Gardens Science, Conservation and Humanities webinar. We're very happy that you're joining us online from places worldwide, as a matter of fact, and from across the United States and New York City for what will be an inspiring hour looking at the wild forest areas of the New York City. I'm Vanessa Sellers, the director of the New York Botanical Gardens Humanities Institute, supported by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. With me in another square box here is my colleague Charles Zimmerman, the Collections and Outreach Administrator for the Garden's William and Linda Steer Herbarium. We both are, of course, delighted and honored to welcome today's presenters, Sarah Charlotte Powers and Helen Forgione, from the Natural Areas Conservancy. I'm now giving the word back to Charles, who will introduce the speakers and also give some further logistic about today's webinar. Welcome again.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Sarah Charlotte Powers is the the executive director and co-founder of the Natural Areas Conservancy. Sarah has 7 years of experience as the parks manager for Scenic Hudson and also worked as a consultant for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority, the New York City Department of Transportation, and the Mohonk Preserve. And we're very glad to have her here with us today. Helen Forgione is the senior ecologist for the Natural Areas Conservancy. In this role, Helen guides the creation and establishment of New York City's natural areas. Helen has over 25 years of experience working in ecology in the New York City metropolitan region and holds a Master's of Science in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Rutgers University. Together, Sarah and Helen will introduce to us today the Forest Management Framework for New York City, a 25-year strategy to manage 70 acres of forested New York City parkland. They will also tell us more about the Natural Areas Conservancy, a nonprofit conservation organization based in NYC. Before we begin, just a reminder to please keep your cameras off and your microphones muted for the duration of the presentation. When our speakers are finished, we'll open up the floor to your questions. You may add questions at any time to the chat, and then Helen and Sarah can answer those during the Q&A. As a reminder, this presentation is going to be recorded and will archived and shared online on the New York Botanical Garden Humanities Institute lecture library. So with no further ado, please welcome Sarah Charlotte Powers and Helen Forgione. And let me make sure that she's muted and can speak. All right, take it off.
All right. Hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to meet you. I think Helen is going to be controlling slides for us, so I'll give her a moment to get this screen share set up and get our slides into presenter mode.
So, Charles, I'll need to have the ability to be the presenter. Thank you.
Pardon our momentary lapse. Oh, here we go.
Okay.
All right, great. Well, thank you again, Charles and Vanessa and the entire team at NYBG for this exciting opportunity. This is Sarah Charlotte Powers kicking us off. I'm going to start today's talk with really doing some setting of the stage of the types of natural spaces that we have here in New York City, their importance and value for New Yorkers, and an overview of the Natural Areas Conservancy and our approach to improving natural habitats in the 5 boroughs. And then I will hand things off to my colleague Helen, who will really give us a deep dive into an exciting collaboration that we've taken on working with nonprofit partners, including NYBG, to advance the management of forest areas in New York City. And then at the end, given this current moment of COVID that we're all living in and navigating, wanted to just share some thoughts and reflections that we've been reflecting on about the role and value of natural spaces in cities in this moment and moving into the future. And I think this unprecedented opportunity that we're having to reimagine public open space within our urban context. So that will be a little kind of closing reflection at the end. But Helen, if you can advance to the next slide. Wanted to start with just a little setting of the stage. So many of the folks on this webinar may have seen this image. This is a rendering from the book Mannahatta by Eric Sanderson. And this really evocative image shows the island of Manhattan as it may have looked in the year 1609. So we're looking from the southern tip of Manhattan north. And there's several things that really jump out at me when I look at this image, but among them is the fact that what we now know as New York City was for millennia a series of islands that were covered in forests and wetlands, and that these places were inhabited by the Lenape Indians and had continuous human use and habitation, again, for millennia before Europeans first arrived. So next slide, when we think of New York City today, and I would expand this to say cities in general, we tend to have images in our minds like the image that we see here on our left. This is the same vantage point looking north from Lower Manhattan. And we tend to think of our cities in terms of their financial, think of them as financial centers, think of them as hubs for culture and commerce. We think of the human diversity and architectural diversity that they provide home to, but we don't always think about the natural systems that underlie those human systems and the way in which the natural landscapes that made these places good places to create cities in the first place continue to play a really important role in how our cities function today. So if you look at the image on the right, this is the other tip of Manhattan, 13 miles to the north, and this is looking south. You see a huge patch of forest. This is over 100 acres of what we call forested natural area in Inwood Hill Park. And we continue, even in a city as dense and as bustling with human activity as New York, to retain big pockets of fairly intact natural habitat that continue both to serve as a connection to our ecological and sort of natural past, but also to provide incredible opportunities for connection with nature for our current urban residents. So in the next couple of slides, and Helen will slowly just kind of give us a little field trip, here are some of the beautiful landscapes that we are lucky enough to work in. These are all city parks located in New York City. And as I mentioned, they contain some of the most gorgeous natural spaces that we have, not just in New York City, but really in our broader region. So it is my pleasure to introduce you today, for those of you who are not familiar with our work, to the Natural Areas Conservancy. I had the great fortune to co-found this organization in 2012 with Bram Gunther, who is a longtime colleague and partner in this work. And this organization is modeled after a very successful form of public-private partnership, which is very common in our city. Started in the late 1970s with the formation of the Central Park Conservancy. There are now more than 40 organizations that function as independent nonprofits. Each of our organizations raise all of our operating dollars through private philanthropy. We employ our staff independently as nonprofit employees. We report to boards of directors, but we all have signed operating agreements that formalize a partnership and a commitment to improving the welfare and condition of public parkland. We are unique among these peer institutions in that we work not in a single park, but rather in more than 50 parks across the city. And our focus is the research, restoration, and management of the 20,000 acres of forest, grassland, and wetland habitat that exist in our city. Combined, these 20,000 acres represent 10% of our city's land area, so a fairly significant geographic spread and a fairly significant mandate for a relatively young and small organization. So next slide. In the next couple of slides, I'm just going to give a little overview of how we approach this work. So the lens through which we seek to enact our mission is really using research and evaluation to understand the condition and distribution of natural spaces across our city. We also work closely with social scientists, especially our colleagues at the U.S. Forest Service, to understand the social dimension of how New Yorkers experience nature, the role of stewardship and volunteerism in caring for these places, as well as understanding the limitations or barriers to use for communities across our city. And then we take these robust data sets that we collect and we use them to create frameworks and policies that allow us to leverage public investment and really improve the management of degraded forests and wetlands. And increasingly, we seek to layer in information about the value of natural areas in combating climate change, as well as understanding the impacts that climate change have on the health and well-being of our natural system. So both adapting our city to climate change, but also mitigating the impacts on natural areas of changes in climate. Next slide. So I wanted to share just a couple of key findings from our early work. In 2013 and 2014, we conducted a robust citywide social and ecological assessment to understand the range of conditions and experiences that are taking place on the 10,000 acres, so half of our city's natural areas that are located on New York City parkland. And with regards to our social findings, the final point on this slide, I think, is the thing that I really want to draw people's attention to, which is 50% of New Yorkers, and this is the results of interviews with thousands of New Yorkers across more than 40 parks. 50% of New Yorkers recreated exclusively or nearly exclusively on city parkland. And so when we think about the value of urban green space, we think frequently about the importance of your neighborhood park, the street tree in front of your house, your community garden. And sometimes for those of us who have the opportunity to get in a car and travel to a state park, or maybe on a summer vacation to a national park, or even to a natural space in a foreign country, we may not think of our natural areas as a key form of access to nature. But when we think about more than 4 million New Yorkers having their full range of access and exposure to nature happening on city parkland, it really invites us to kind of reframe and really rethink about the value of these natural spaces within the larger urban parks context. Next slide. The second set of findings come from our ecological assessment. And for those of you who are biophysical scientists, these may be surprising. We found that New York City's forests are in many ways in a surprisingly healthy condition. Our forest canopy is over 80% native species, and our midstory is not far behind. We have an incredible amount of biodiversity in our ecological communities and our plant life, and we also support thousands of species of animals, birds, insects in our natural spaces. However, we see huge signs of pressure and even decline in these forested natural areas. And that's underscored by a significant drop off in the percent of native species in our understory, so that's our young forests, as well as threats from things like deer browse and invasive species really crowding out some of our healthy native mature forests and really calling some questions about the most appropriate approaches to management over the long term. Next slide. So after synthesizing these huge amounts of data, we worked closely with our partners at the New York City Department of Parks and Recreation to develop the forest management framework for New York City. So New York City has invested through its natural resources group for decades in the management of natural areas. But this forest management framework is innovative in a couple of key ways. The first is that it shifts away from focusing on restoration and planting as the primary activity and moves us towards a framework that's really about active management of all 7,300 acres of forest under the city's jurisdiction. So shifting from thinking about big, financially intensive projects where we go in and kind of pick the most degraded places and treat them as large afforestation opportunities, and really thinking about employing kind of a full suite of silvicultural and forest management techniques to provide a more nuanced and much more widespread approach to management. A couple of other key components. This framework looks significantly at the human experience, volunteerism, recreation, and green jobs of our forests. So again, the metrics are not purely about the number of trees planted. And maybe most significantly, we were able to work with an economist and to take the range of conditions and activities that we recommended in our management and to use them to create a financial model that allowed us to estimate both an annual cost of doing this work as well as a 25-year price tag, which has been really important for being able to advocate for increased funding and staffing to do this work. Next slide.
Okay, and that's where I come into things here. Let me make sure I'm not muted.
We can hear you.
We can hear you.
Thank you. So in this, so first off, I'm happy to introduce myself. I'm Helen Forgione at the Natural Areas Conservancy, and thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to tell you about our programs and in particular how we're using our Conservancy Engagement Program to align the work of multiple nonprofits throughout the city in the on-the-ground work that they do in forests to stack up and align with all of the work that we have put together in our forest management framework. I'll be going through the elements of the program, some of our results, how we've been working together over the last 2 years, And in particular, I'll go through some of the work that we have recommended for Bronx Park, in which the New York Botanical Garden holds its campus. So, so again, as Sarah was saying, when we along with the New York City Parks Department, put together the forest management framework for the city about 2 years ago, we saw the bottom line price tag and realized that we need to have all of the different groups that are conducting management become invested in using this strategy, this framework, and have their work be accountable, trackable, and building together to accomplish the goals of the framework, which are notably 100% active management in all of our forest and natural areas. So the Conservancy Engagement Program itself is an iterative process in which the Natural Areas Conservancy engages with nonprofits in office presentations and discussions, as well as introduction to the different tools that are used in the forest management framework for collecting data, monitoring and assessing the forests on the ground prior to conducting management and post conducting management, show our progress. And that involves introduction to the tools that we use, which are not only based in data collection, but also guide us towards the management which we would conduct on the ground. As a result of the engagement program, we build together the recommendations for the individual either parks or forests. We develop cost estimates based on that same financial model that Sarah talked about, that is the basis of the forest management framework. And that enables the different conservancies to either raise funds or allocate resources or anticipate the costs for conducting management over both the short and long term of the 25-year management framework. The park conservancies also have access to the database and maps, digital information that are the result of this engagement process, and past data from studies. If this program has been in effect for 2 years, and altogether in 2018 and 19, we worked with, sorry here, 1, 2, 3, 6 different organizations in 4 different parks, covering hundreds of acres in forest management recommendations being produced. This year, we worked with Riverside Park in Manhattan and Bronx Park in the Bronx. And as always, we work with our municipal partner, New York City Parks, Forestry, Horticulture, and Natural Resources Division, which is responsible for forest management in all 10,000 acres of natural space in the city parks. So specifically, I'll be talking about our work in Bronx Park. And people don't often think about Bronx Park as an individual park, but the land in which the Wildlife Conservation Center, the Bronx Zoo, outlined here in that blue lump to the south, and the central portion outlined in orange, the New York Botanical Garden, and the northern portion, which is part of the floodplain forest, are all on city property, which collectively is referred to as Bronx Park. But all of these entities conduct management in their natural areas, as well as in their more highly manicured or landscaped or built environment. We worked in 2019 with, and I'm just going to go back, with those 4 groups, the New York City Parks Natural Resources Forest Restoration Team, the New York Botanical Garden, and specifically working with the managers of the Thane Family Forest, Wildlife Conservation Society in the Bronx Zoo, and the Bronx River Alliance, a nonprofit that works in multiple parks up and down the Bronx River. So we relied on a lot of past collected data and studies which were conducted by all of the groups, but we also looked at the area which had not been previously assessed or studied, and it amounted to about 99 acres. This included sites in the Bronx Park, which we're collectively calling the Bronx River Forest, or Bronx River Floodplain Forest. Sites in New York Botanical Garden, which are not a part of the Thane Family Forest, but are south of there, and some other small areas north of there. In the Bronx Zoo, over 25 acres of forested woodland surrounding the exhibits of the zoo, which are not accessible to the public and do not have live animals roaming through them. And we used a methodology which New York City Parks has adopted and co-developed with the Natural Areas Conservancy, called a rapid site assessment. This differs from the Natural Areas Conservancy's ecological assessment, which we conducted or completed in 2014, in that it's a bridged way to assess space based on delineating a discrete site boundary. So in the image on the right of the screen, these outlined pink areas are considered sites where management is being proposed. Before that management can be scoped and understood, we need to know what the condition of these sites are. And so we collect data that refers to the entire site, and then in these circular plots that you see within those sites, we collect discrete metrics, measurements of the different vegetation layers in the forest, beginning with the canopy and going all the way down to the understory ground cover layer. We make measurements of species, the composition, the sizes, the quantity, the percent cover, and that results in a very robust picture of the conditions on that site at that time. So that's what we call a rapid site assessment. And that data is uploaded into a system which is now being quality controlled and managed by the Natural Areas Conservancy, along with the New York City Parks Department. As a part of that tool, for the rapid site assessment, there's a component called the FIRST tool, FIRST, which stands for Forest Identification and Restoration Selection Tool. It's basically a dichotomous key, but it is downloadable and digital, which by pressing a button and reading through a series of questions, you choose the correct response to the question and end up with a definition of the kind of forest community that you are in. This enables us to record that information as we do the rapid site assessment, as well as it lists a planting palette, a planting list for that site forest type, which can be used in scoping restoration. This is a shot of the planting palette for one of the particular vegetation and forest communities, high Allegheny, rich red oak, sugar maple forest. It contains a description of that kind of community, a list of the species that are found in it, and it ranks them into different tiers. These tiers are based on the climate adaptation resilience of the different plants, the woody species that are found in those communities. This is a result of a project that the Natural Areas Conservancy accomplished a year ago to assess the different climate adaptation resilience of different species, native species in our forests. It's available online, and I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's a really strong component of our management recommendations. So what we've done in using that rapid site assessment of all of the sites in Bronx Park is to assign them a forest community type based on our observations. You can see in the A panel that our Bronx River floodplain forests, the areas that Bronx River Alliance manages, we have a couple different floodplain types: green ash, mixed hardwood, silver maple floodplain forest. Whereas in the southern part of New York Botanical Garden, which we conducted the rapid site assessment in, and the Bronx Zoo forest, which we assessed, we have a coastal oak hickory type or oak tulip tree types as well, along with one swamp. There are also a couple spots of successional southern hardwoods and even an invasive Norway maple forest type, which we found. Well, once we take all of that data, all of that information that we collected in the field with all of the different conditions of invasive or native species at the various levels, the canopy layer, the subcanopy made up of shrub species and regenerating young trees, the seedling layer looking at the different components of the woody seedlings that are growing or germinating, and the herbaceous layer, we build that into a picture of what the threat level is in those different sites. This is all based on the structure of our forest management framework, and there's lots of nuts and bolts that go into that. It's explained in our forest management framework document and several publications, which I would be happy to put at your hands. But the way we use that information is to assign a threat level to the site, which then has a accompanying work type, which is recommended to address that threat level. What we found in Bronx Park was that the majority of the sites that we assessed were at a low threat level, which is good news. About 77 acres of forest that are doing moderately well. And then we also found that about 22 acres are in a medium threat level, a little bit more in danger of and more degraded. What we then did after we got that picture of what was on the ground was we thought about how the different entities that we're working with, the New York Botanical Garden and Bronx River Alliance, Wildlife Conservation Society, what their missions and their visions are for their forests. So we want to consider all of that as we develop our recommendations together. The work that has been done in the past by these organizations is really important to weave in and consider as we go forward. So as I was laying out previously, we have a series of presentations at different steps along the way in our work together of going over the data, going over our findings, summarizing past reports, summarizing past studies, and together we then take that information and workshop different recommendations. Those recommendations in the amount to park-wide management strategies, strategies that we want to use across all of the different managers of the forests, and think about how we can be more effective in not only aligning our work with citywide management framework, but how we can align our work within the park. Because what you do in across the river is going to impact the forest on the other side, or on the other side of the Bronx River Parkway, or the various borders of our individual forest parcels. We also put together a park-wide action plan, a plan for how to progressively work through the different site areas and what kind of strategies we'll take. And then from that are also cost estimates, what it will cost to achieve each one of those management actions over the short term, a kind of 1 to 5 year frame, and then over the long term, what it will take to maintain good forest health over that 25-year planning window of the management framework. We also come up with site-specific action plans, and I'll show you some of those as well. But talking about that kind of upper high-level approach to using the past plans and new data to inform our management, we look at a bigger picture strategy for going into the future, coordinating our management together through applications, looking at our funding sources, tracking our work as we progress in the tools that are already developed, the rapid site assessment, and continuing to meet regularly to strategize and plan. So here is one of the first strategies, park-wide management strategies that we developed. We want to coordinate our invasive species control together. What we eliminate in one, in the New York Botanical Garden might become not feasible to control if it's not being controlled over in the Bronx Zoo at the same time. So we want to coordinate those strategies. We want to use our best management practices, which were already developed by the Thane Family Forest Program and New York City Parks guidelines for urban forest restoration. We want to use the knowledge that one entity has developed so that we're not reinventing the wheel just across the parkway. Especially when we're looking at things like early intervention for emerging invasives that we see traveling along the Bronx River corridor or highway corridor. We want to think holistically about some of the issues that are being impacted by invasive insect pests, such as the emerald ash borer, when we look at our Fraxinus population in being such a strong component in the floodplains. And we want to make sure that we are able to support the tracking of the work we've done by using the tools effectively. A second strategy is to use those targeted forest type community designations to increase habitat connectivity across all these small patches of woodland and forest to increase the size and continuity of the forest communities and thinking about that species composition. Using those to strategically transform sites so that we are going toward using specific composition. And strategies involved in there is removing invasives mid-story, planting native plants in the mid-story and seedlings layer. And towards that, we developed a kind of revised map of the target forest community types. And here it's really thinking about, where we have these smaller patches and encouraging the components across that community type to not only bolster the plant populations, but think about how wildlife can be more supported in having better continuity of forest types. Using the first tool in that way is also important in considering the changing climate that we are now coping with worldwide. We also want to change that invasive forest trajectory that we see in places where the different forest layers are dominated by invasive species. We want to remove even the overstory canopy trees, midstory and herbaceous plants, and replant with native components. An example of that is in the Norway maple forest site in the Bronx River floodplain. We want to create a greater forest structural diversity, and that comes down to even thinking about leaving fallen trees and limbs on site and maintaining that litter layer to improve forest health and wildlife support. Increasing the native herbaceous plant diversity. We have great resources in the New York Botanical Garden propagation, as well as the Greenbelt Native Plant Center, which is based on Staten Island, to bolster up that herbaceous layer diversity through seeding and planting live material, plants and bugs. You can even think about reintroducing some extirpated species, which were once components in the Bronx. So these next three slides show a example of one of the site-specific action plans. This is for one particular forest site, and it takes you through a summary of the data in which we collected, breaking it down into kind of graphical images of the condition. For instance, here you can see in this lower part of the panel the change in native overstory in dark green, all the way down to native ground cover in the bottom strip, the reduction in native status. We further break that down into the different layers and describe what are the plants that actually make up those components. And that these sheets enable a manager to really have a snapshot of what's going on in that site and to start to strategize their work. We also take that information and come up with work type recommendations. In this particular site, the threat level is low, and the work type which is suggested there is to conduct forest management using an in-house team or crew. And the bottom part of this panel shows how that would progress through years 1 through 5 in the short-term management, beginning with the activities that would be conducted in years 1 through years 5, including planting, kind of management and methodology which is proposed. And I will leave my summary at that and turn this over again to Sarah, but I'm really happy to answer any questions later during our presentation and go into more detail about what we've done together in the Conservancy Engagement Program.
Thank you so much, Helen. Helen is a font of knowledge, and I do really encourage people to follow up with her with any detailed questions about the ecology of these parks and the approaches to management. You couldn't talk to a more informed person about those topics. I'm going to just zoom us back up to kind of two high-level thoughts for closing. If we can go to the next slide. Cool. So I wanted to share as I mentioned, two thoughts about kind of changing role and sort of perceptions of urban natural areas in this COVID and post-COVID moment. And the first piece is actually sharing a little bit of, I'd say, kind of a sneak preview of some research that was done by somebody on our staff. This is an effort to calculate the carbon that is stored and sequestered in our natural areas. And without spending too much time on this, I share it for sort of two reasons and reflections. The first is that according to our calculations, our forested natural areas stores 3 times more carbon than previously calculated and anticipated. And only about a third of that carbon is in the trees themselves, and the other 2/3 are in other parts of the forest, including a significant amount in our soil. And I share this because I think as we've thought in the past about the benefit of our forested natural areas, we've thought about them somewhat narrowly. As a larger community, there's been a lot of focus on cooling and some focus on habitat, and from time to time, maybe some conversation about recreation. But with just a little bit more digging and a little more analysis, our urban natural areas have the potential to really take their place more fully in our understanding of urban sustainability and contributing in a whole suite of ways to the sort of sustainability and well-being and quality of life of our urban experience. And so we'd be happy to share more about the carbon piece specifically, but that's sort of one concept that I think is just beginning to be advanced in a more comprehensive way by cities across the country. And then the second piece, next slide, is these are just 4 of literally dozens of headlines and posts that I've collected over the last month and a half or so that are highlighting in both our local papers and in national and even international publications the value and the sort of importance that parks are playing for people who are sheltering in place, self-isolating, social distancing, kind of along that spectrum. There's very few places where people can get outside and recreate right now besides public parkland. And at the same time that we're seeing this incredible uptick in use of all parts of our park systems, including our natural areas, we're also looking at budgets locally and in cities around our country at proposed budget cuts that will significantly impact the ability of both the public sector and the nonprofit sector to meaningfully manage these places. And so just wanted to kind of highlight, I don't know for the folks on this call what your personal experiences have been, but for our staff, some of whom are still reporting to and working in parks, this feels like a real watershed moment in terms of an increased awareness by New Yorkers about the critical need for these places. And I think we'll see an interesting opportunity in the year ahead and years beyond that to kind of marry together this approach that's really about sort of science and synthesis with a real need to kind of respond to the immediacy of the public's need for safe places to recreate and experience nature. And with that, if we can go to the last slide. Just want to thank everybody for joining today and move into the question and answer portion of this talk.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Helen, for that presentation. There's so much for all of us to learn about our city's natural spaces, and really appreciate all the work that you do to support those goals. So for everyone here in the audience, if you'd like to speak out with your questions, you can use the hand raise feature or type into the chat hand. Let us know if you'd like to be unmuted and you'd like to speak your question out loud. Otherwise, you can just type in your questions and we'll raise them for Helen and Sarah to answer. So we actually already have a few questions lined up. Taryn asks, what are some of the extirpated species in New York?
Mm. Wow, that's a really good question. In fact, I might just tap Daniel Atha, who's just done a really interesting comparison of species that were found in Central Park and in the New York Botanical Garden. I don't remember the exact time frame, but you know, in the earlier part of the century, the last century, all the way to what is currently being surveyed, and he could probably have the much more definitive answer. But citywide, there has been like a tremendous reduction in our native flora, and along with that, an uptick in our invasive introduced and introduced species from other continents. So so there's been quite a shift. As far as specific reintroductions, you know, that's something that we'd want to think about very carefully and not go about kind of in a willy-nilly way, but think about what are some typical components of a forest type or another vegetation type, and what would be some potential wins, either populations that need bolstering up with more genetic vigor, and by using other seed sources that are in our surrounding natural spaces, and that's you know, something that we really want to undertake in a very strategic way. I don't know, Daniel, if you wanted to throw in anything there.
Hi, can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can see
Great.
you.
Well, wonderful presentation. I
on the
look
spot.
forward to working with you on helping to assess and restore these communities. At the New York Botanical Garden, we're obviously focused on the plants, and I think our great strength as a collections-based institution is to focus at the species level and at the genus level to assess the historical flora of New York City, the current flora, and also to monitor for the emerging invasive species that are coming in all of the time in New York City, being the epicenter for trade and travel into the city. So for the extirpated species that are no longer here, we think that there are probably about 400 species that have been eliminated from the flora of New York City over the last 200 years. We think that the most devastating period was right around 1900. Obviously, that's when New York City expanded most quickly and devastating to the habitats and to the plants and animals of New York City. So as just one example, in the goldenrod group, genus Solidago, there are 19 historical species known from New York City, and today we have 16 species left. So we've lost 3 goldenrod species that are no longer known from the flora of New York City. And some of these, like the stiff goldenrod, is planted. It's available in the nursery trade. So that's one that grows in meadows and grasslands that could easily be restored and is a fantastic plant for butterflies, bees, and other pollinators that, you know, we as we learn and detail the lost species, I think then we'll be in a much better position to start bringing them back in appropriate places in
that's
habitats where they typically grow, like grasslands and so forth. So thanks for the opportunity to share.
Right. Thank you so much, Daniel, for chiming in.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have a lot of great questions coming in, actually. Leaf Miles asks, Helen, has rapid site assessment been done in Inwood Hill Park recently? And is this info available to the public?
Yeah, in Inwood Hill Park, in fact, that large, over 100-acre forested park, that was the site where we conducted the ecological assessment that in 2014. So that data is available. As far as a rapid site assessment, we have not worked with a conservancy there to conduct, but New York City Parks, in doing their forest restoration, prior to doing their management work, they have conducted rapid site assessments of those places where they have taken on work. So it's not an assessment which is an end-to-end kind of study, but in those smaller places there is data. And is it available to the public? If it is collected by New York City Parks, it can be made available. And if there's information that a group needs and wants, the Natural Areas Conservancy also makes data available through sharing as well. So I encourage you to get in touch with me with the email address that we had up on that last slide, and I can pop it up again. And we'll see what we can get you, what you need.
Thank you, Sarah. Natalia asks, she's wondering whether or not this data can be used for educational purposes as well, especially now with schools being closed and fewer opportunities to go out into nature and learn firsthand. So could your resources be used to develop teaching materials and teaching students about natural areas around the city?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we don't currently have a sort of focal area of K through 12 education. We do run a program to train college-aged scientists, but we are very interested and open to partnership with organizations that are working with school-age demographic. So we don't have a full-time educator on our team to help us with packaging that content, but we are very much interested in working with others to provide sort of substance and content that they could bring to their audiences. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you would be interested in partnering in that capacity.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say that the rapid site assessment, one of the tremendous jobs that City University of New York students did was use that methodology in our internship program to really jumpstart rapid site assessments throughout the whole city. So our CUNY internship program was really wonderful bunch of students that really made that work happen. So yeah, it's a great resource.
And on that topic, Alyssa just shared that she uses the NAC protocol with students at Wave Hill, and they're currently developing curriculum.
Yay.
So that's great. Chelsea asks, have you experienced differing acceptance or resistance to NAC plans by various conservancies or various levels to plan implementation over the first 2 years?
The program was a free program from the Natural Areas Conservancy, and it was open to any conservancy that applied, and of course in a limited way. We only had 2 years of funding and worked with 2 conservancies a year, So anybody who joined the program were interested in the tools and in implementation and in advancing management in their parks. So certainly the different groups had different capacities and different strengths, and so we really wanted to acknowledge that and tailor the work to what would be most effective with them. So in that way, there's been different levels of ability to implement among the groups the first 2 years, but everyone who has been a part of it was at their own desire. So yeah.
Great. We're technically out of time, but if the two of you still have time to answer more questions, we have more great questions coming in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I'm good for it.
Yeah, happy to stay on for a few more minutes.
Super. Jonathan Brady asks, you referenced a new understanding about how much carbon is stored in forests. Does that new understanding pertain to New York City and to urban forest, or to just forests in general?
Sure, great question. So the calculations that I referenced specifically relate to the 7,300 acres of forested natural areas that we've been talking about on our presentation today. And the focus was largely about distinguishing the value of those natural forest areas from the larger urban forest. There's a suite of tools available from the US Forest Service, among others, that calculates kind of at a wall-to-wall scale everything that has canopy, but due to a lack of stratification in their sampling methods, we had a hunch that they were significantly underestimating the carbon benefits of our what we call forested natural areas, what you might just think of as forests, but kind of woodland areas. So yes, those calculations are specifically for those areas. And the hope that we have is to begin, we have a sort of nascent partnership with teams of cities who do similar work from across the US to begin to use data from our different cities to start to build out more of a comprehensive understanding of the value at a national scale of urban forested natural areas, of which there are more than 1 million acres. So it's potentially something that could become more of a market mechanism and even maybe a funding source to support some of this work over time.
Thank you, Sarah. Todd Forrest had his hand up earlier, but he's had to leave the meeting, but he did share a link to the New York Botanical Gardens forest plan and list of species once noted as spontaneous in New York City. So if anyone's interested in seeing that, it's posted in the chat. Next, Wendy asks about the long-term success of your restoration plantings, especially the herbaceous ones. Do you have any data on their success after 5 years, or what factors may increase their success?
Yeah. So the rapid site assessment is has not been used as kind of like a post-management measurement yet. This is just the second year it's been in operation. So, when it's been used so far as a pre-management tool, and then the management is underway, and then we'll conduct an assessment post and use that to sort of gauge our success over time. But as far as management, which has previous management that's been part of New York City Parks forest restoration, there have been monitoring plots of the Million Trees plantings. So there were about 500 acres of plantings in natural areas. And there was a study that was done by City Parks to look at the success in the short term over a number of, it was 3 years. And they found a very high success rate of those smaller trees. I think it was over 80% survival rate over that short term. And certainly over the long term, we're going to want to be able to track what's been happening as a result of our management and restoration. I'm thinking about herbaceous plants. Planting the herbaceous layer is a relatively new regular strategy in city parks. It's not been a regular component of the work. So as far as like how successful that has been, I know that that's something that is often an afterthought or is really hard to track over time as well. So we'll be really curious to see how this does go, and we will be wanting to monitor that really closely to see the success. As far as what might increase the success, I think that controlling the invasives, continuing to maintain those restoration sites after the first planting. I think a lot of people envision it. You plant it and you walk away and it's all good. But something that certainly we have found and is the basis of the management framework is that continuous management is needed. You can't walk away and expect that our forests can survive in a good condition without continued maintenance. That's kind of why we've built it in this way, that we do 2 years of restoration, 2 years of management before we do planting on a really large scale level, and then we continue to maintain the area and then monitor it into perpetuity to make sure that we're not letting it go. So that's a really good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Stephen asks, are there any opportunities to increase park coverage in New York City, such as purchasing abandoned land or preventing development in certain areas when it becomes available?
Sure, maybe I can take a first stab at that, and Helen can add on. But I think there are occasionally still opportunities to purchase parcels that have habitat potential or habitat value. Increasingly, as our city has really been built out, there's fewer and fewer opportunities. One of the places where there's significant value to be captured is looking at changes to zoning regulations in ways that habitat value on private property can be more formally protected. So Helen has participated in a process, which I can let her describe in more detail, but there are specific areas within New York City where there are special zoning requirements that are intended to specifically to protect habitat. And I think there's a lot of potential when there's conversations, for example, about having a comprehensive zoning plan for New York City as a sort of aspirational topic, to think about not just acquisition, but kind of the full suite of tools in our city's toolbox to protect value in those ways. And maybe Helen can, if you want, you can describe that layer a little bit in more detail.
Yeah. So Sarah is referring to these special natural area districts in the city, and in particular, there's one in the Bronx, and there's one in Staten Island, and the larger area is Staten Island, and as you can imagine, there's not a lot of open space throughout the city that isn't already built on, but Staten Island does contain the most in the 5 boroughs. It also is in the most natural state, as in not necessarily an empty lot, but in an area that hasn't been heavily impacted except maybe by farming in the past. And there's some really important natural features that was the impetus behind creating that natural area district decades ago. And they are the wetlands, the freshwater wetlands, streams, some really unique forest types, soil conditions, just really amazing natural spaces. And outright purchase is incredibly expensive, and especially with development being so lucrative, so that we're looking at zoning regulations as a way of guiding more thoughtful development in those places. And it's very difficult. It's a process that involves thinking about our economic conditions in the city, as well as our valuable natural resources and biodiversity. It's still in the works through the Department of City Planning, and New York City Parks and Natural Areas Conservancy have contributed as much information and guidance as we can, thinking about the connectivity to other natural areas like parkland, and making a higher priority to preserve those areas. But it's a really complicated process, and definitely needs support of the community to really make happen as well.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you, Sarah. We still have questions coming in, but we might never end if we just keep going. So thank you all for participating and for sharing your questions. I'll save the chat and share it with Sarah and Helen so that they can have a chance to answer those with you individually. But thank you all for attending today's presentations. If you missed any or part of it or want to watch it again, we'll be recording this and archiving it online on the New York Botanical Garden Humanities Institute Lecture Library. So I will unmute Vanessa. Oh, she's unmuted, so she can say goodbye as well.
Goodbye to everybody, and thank you to the speakers. Very interesting research, and we're looking forward to continuing the conversation in the future. And thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.